The cannons thundered across the Baltic archipelago on that summer morning of July 27, 1720, as a Swedish squadron under Vice Admiral Carl Georg Sjöblad pressed forward into the treacherous waters near Grengam Island. The Swedish squadron, consisting of a 52-gun ship of the line, 4 frigates, and 9 smaller craft with a total of 156 guns and over 1,000 marines, made an attempt to attack the moving Russian fleet. What followed was a masterclass in tactical deception and naval warfare that would become the final major engagement of the Great Northern War, but not in the way Sweden had hoped. General Mikhail Golitsyn's Russian galley fleet of 61 galleys and 29 island boats, yielding to the enemy's superior artillery power, retreated to the Skerries, enticing the Swedish vessels into a disadvantageous position among the granite coastal boulders. The Battle of Grengam would demonstrate that in the maze of Baltic islands and shallow waters, nimble galleys commanded by cunning admirals could still triumph over the thundering broadside power of traditional warships. 2 towering figures dominated the stage of Northern European politics as the 18th century dawned: the teenage Swedish king Charles IV and the ambitious Russian Tsar Peter IV, Peter the Great. Their collision would reshape the balance of power in the Baltic for centuries to come, but in 1700, few could have predicted that the vast Swedish Empire that included Estonia, Scandinavia, except for Norway, Finland, and the Baltic Islands would face its greatest existential threat from a nation that barely possessed a navy. Sweden's expansion in the Baltic Sea coastlands during the 16th and 17th centuries had antagonized the neighboring states. Russia's access to the Baltic was blocked by Swedish-held Karelia, Ingria, Estonia, and Livonia. Denmark-Norway resented its loss to Sweden of provinces in the Scandinavian peninsula. The Swedish grip on Baltic commerce was strangling the ambitions of every power that bordered those vital waters. Sweden also controlled the trade routes along the rivers Neva, Elbe, Oder, and Divina. The Swedish army could march anywhere in Europe, which made them a key player in war and peace. But Peter the Great harbored a vision that would transform his landlocked empire into a maritime power. Since 1697, Peter had been expressing his desire to capture territory on the Baltic Sea so he could build a port there. The young Tsar understood what his predecessors had missed. Peter realized his imperial ambitions for Russia required that it be not just a land power, but a sea power as well. When the death of the Swedish king Charles the XVIII in 1697, when his heir, Charles XIV, was but a boy of 14, became the signal for Denmark-Norway to organize an anti-Swedish coalition, Peter saw his opportunity. Frederick IV of Denmark, Peter I of Russia, and Augustus, Elector of Saxony and King of Poland, entered into a secret alliance, 1699, to curb Swedish power. They determined to take advantage of Charles's youth and inexperience with a relatively simple plan. Danish King Frederick would invade Swedish territory in the west, and while he kept the Swedes busy, the Russians and Poles would attack in the east. What they failed to anticipate was that the boy king possessed the unique ability of imposing his will on any given situation, and the equally unique fortune of almost always coming out ahead in the game. The stage was set for a conflict that would last over 2 decades and fundamentally alter the European balance of power. The Great Northern War was about to begin. Peter the Great's attempt to build a Black Sea fleet came crashing down ignominiously in the face of Turkish naval superiority in 1710. With Black Sea hopes dashed, Russia was left with another option for warm water access to the open ocean, the Baltic. But there was a profound problem. Russia had no naval tradition whatsoever. While Sweden's sailors had been mastering the Baltic's treacherous waters for generations, Russia's maritime experience barely extended beyond river barges and fishing boats. The transformation began with characteristic Petrine audacity. Peter the Great was many things, one of them being a naval visionary. He was the father of the Russian Navy, founder of the Russian Naval School, the Tsar who worked himself through the ranks to truly acquire the skills and honestly attain the rank of Rear Admiral. In an extraordinary display of royal humility, Peter donned a sailor's uniform and learned seamanship from the deck up, wielding an axe in Dutch shipyards and studying navigation charts by candlelight. This was no ceremonial exercise. The Tsar of all the Russias genuinely intended to build a fleet from nothing. The vessels were ungainly in design, made from less than ideal wood, with subpar cannon manned by crews inferior in their gunnery, but a fleet nonetheless. Russian shipwrights, working with inferior Baltic pine instead of sturdy English oak, struggled to construct vessels that could withstand the punishing storms of the northern seas. In 1700, the Russian Admiralty was established. In 1705, the Navy began recruiting specialized seamen. In 1715, the prestigious Naval Academy came into being, and by 1724, there were 32 ships of the line in the Baltic Fleet. And he had a valuable mentor in the form of Count Fyodor Apraksin, Russia's first admiral and a general of renown before that. Apraksin faced the monumental task of creating naval officers from a nation of landlubbers, transforming Cossack cavalrymen and Moscow musketeers into sailors capable of handling complex rigging and coordinating broadside attacks. The early results were often disastrous. Russian ships ran aground in their own harbors, crews mutinied against the alien demands of naval discipline, and more than one vessel was lost to incompetent navigation. Yet Peter's determination proved infectious. Meanwhile, the Russians under Peter the Great had used this period to reorganize their army and to establish themselves on the eastern Baltic coast. Peter had founded the city of St. Petersburg and the naval port of Kronstadt in 1703. From these precarious footholds on conquered Swedish territory, Peter began assembling the tools of naval warfare. Shipyards, foundries for casting cannons, and training grounds where Russian peasants learned the arcane arts of seamanship. The Baltic would soon witness whether this improvised navy could challenge Sweden's centuries-old mastery of these waters. While Peter's Russians hammered together their first crude warships, Sweden commanded the Baltic with a naval tradition stretching back centuries. Swedish Admiralty records bore witness to victories that had made the Baltic Sea a virtual Swedish lake. From the thunderous broadsides that had shattered Danish fleets to the precision maneuvers that had outfoxed Polish galleys in the narrow straits of the archipelago. The Swedish naval design philosophy reflected a unique understanding of Baltic warfare. Unlike the lumbering ships of the line that dominated Atlantic battles, Swedish vessels were built for the peculiar demands of archipelago fighting. Their ships drew less water to navigate the shallow channels between islands, yet carried enough firepower to devastate any opponent foolish enough to challenge them in open water. The Swedish shipwrights had perfected a deadly balance. Vessels nimble enough to exploit the labyrinthine waterways of the Finnish skerries, yet powerful enough to stand toe-to-toe with any fleet in Europe. The Swedish squadron, consisting of a 52-gun ship of the line, 4 frigates and 9 smaller craft with a total of 156 guns, and over 1,000 Marines, represented the culmination of this naval evolution. The flagship alone, a magnificent 52-gun vessel, could unleash a broadside that would reduce most opponents to floating wreckage. Her frigate escorts, sleek predators armed with between 18 and 34 guns each, were designed to hunt in packs, using their superior speed and maneuverability to isolate and destroy enemy vessels. But Sweden's true advantage lay not in the ships themselves, but in the men who sailed them. Swedish naval officers learned their craft in the unforgiving waters of the Baltic, where a miscalculation could dash a ship against granite cliffs or strand it helplessly on hidden reefs. They understood the treacherous interplay of wind, current, and tide that could transform a tactical advantage into disaster in minutes. These were sailors who could read the subtle signs of an approaching Baltic squall, who knew which channels remained navigable at low tide, and who could execute complex maneuvers in the tight confines of island passages that would terrify admirals from calmer seas. The Swedish naval tradition had been forged in countless engagements where seamanship mattered more than raw firepower, where a captain's intimate knowledge of local waters could turn a pursuing enemy into prey. As they prepared to face Golitsyn's Russian galleys, they carried with them the confidence of a maritime people who had never truly been challenged in their home waters. Vice Admiral Karl Georg Sjöblad stood on the quarterdeck of his flagship, surveying the waters ahead with the practiced eye of a naval veteran. Sjöblad embodied the Swedish naval tradition at its finest, a commander who had cut his teeth in the brutal campaigns of the Great Northern War, where survival often depended more on tactical cunning than overwhelming force. His weathered hands bore the scars of countless engagements, and his steely gaze had witnessed the gradual erosion of Swedish naval supremacy as Peter's upstart fleet grew bolder with each passing season. The Swedish admiral faced a peculiar challenge that summer of 1720. His adversary was no ordinary naval commander, but General Mikhail Golitsyn, a shrewd and experienced officer who had earned his reputation not on the open seas, but in the labyrinthine world of galley warfare among the skerries. Golitsyn represented a new breed of Russian naval leader, men who had learned to compensate for their lack of traditional seafaring heritage with innovative tactics and an intimate understanding of the Baltic's unique geography, where Sjöblad commanded vessels designed for the thunderous broadside exchanges of conventional naval warfare. Golitsyn had mastered the art of galley combat, a form of fighting that harkened back to ancient Mediterranean battles. The galley fleet under the command of the General M.M. Golitsyn, 61 galleys and 29 boats, 52 guns, represented a radically different approach to naval warfare. These vessels relied not on wind power, but on the coordinated stroke of hundreds of oars, allowing them to maneuver with deadly precision in calm conditions where sailing ships lay helpless. Golitsyn's genius lay in recognizing that the complex archipelago landscape of the Baltic could neutralize many of the advantages held by traditional warships. His galleys could dart between islands like wolves among sheep, using their shallow draft to access waters where deeper Swedish vessels dared not follow. More crucially, Golitsyn possessed something that many Russian commanders still lacked: genuine combat experience against Swedish forces and the hard-won knowledge of how to turn apparent weakness into tactical advantage. The stage was set for a confrontation between two fundamentally different naval philosophies: Sjöblad's conventional firepower supremacy against Golitsyn's unconventional mobility and terrain exploitation. Both commanders knew that this engagement would test not just their personal skills, but the very future of naval warfare in the Baltic's contested waters. The summer of 1720 found the Baltic Sea transformed into a chessboard of strategic desperation. After the death of Charles the Vaorad, Sweden still refused to make peace with Russia on Peter's terms. Despite a continued Swedish naval presence and strong patrols to protect the coast, small Russian raids took place in 1716 at Öregrund, while in July 1717 a Russian squadron landed troops at Gotland who raided for supplies. The death of the warrior king at Fredrikshald in 1718 had left Sweden rudderless, its new government desperately seeking to salvage what remained of their Baltic Empire, while Russian forces pressed ever closer to the Swedish heartland. To place pressure on Sweden, Russia sent a large fleet to the Swedish east coast in July 1719. There, under protection of the Russian battle fleet, the Russian galley fleet was split into three groups. One group headed for the coast of Uppland, the second to the vicinity of Stockholm, and the last to coast of Zudermanland. Together they carried a landing force of nearly 30,000 men. The audacious raids that followed sent shockwaves through Swedish society. Raiding continued for a month, and devastated amongst others the towns of Norrtälje, Södertälje, Nyköping, and Norrköping. and almost all the buildings in the archipelago of Stockholm were burned. By the summer of 1720, the strategic situation had crystallized into a deadly game of cat and mouse. Peter I ordered the fleet, 52 galleys and 15 boats with 52 guns and 11,000 troops ready for the deployment, under command of General M.M. Golitsyn, to reach Åland Islands in the Gulf of Bothnia. The goal of the operation was to force the Swedes out from the archipelago. The Åland Islands represented the last Swedish stronghold guarding the approaches to Stockholm. Lose them, and the Swedish capital itself would lie exposed to Russian assault. For Sjöblad, the mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. His squadron represented one of Sweden's last mobile naval forces, capable of challenging Russian operations in these waters. Every day that Golitsyn's galleys remained unopposed in the archipelago brought fresh reports of burned villages and captured supply convoys. The Swedish public, already war-weary after 2 decades of conflict, was demanding action from their navy, the same navy that had once ruled these waters unchallenged. The intelligence reaching Swedish naval headquarters painted an increasingly dire picture. Russian scouting vessels had been spotted probing the outer defenses of the archipelago, testing Swedish response times and mapping the intricate network of channels that wound between the islands. Golitsyn was clearly preparing for something larger than mere raiding, perhaps a direct assault on the Swedish positions that guarded the sea routes to Stockholm itself. As July drew toward its climactic end, both commanders found themselves drawn inexorably toward a confrontation that neither could avoid. The strategic imperatives of their respective nations had created a collision course in the narrow waters near Grengam Island, where the fate of Swedish naval power in the Baltic would be decided once and for all. The morning of July 27, 1720, broke with deceptive tranquility over the Baltic archipelago. A gentle breeze stirred the waters around Grengam Island, carrying the salt tang of the sea mingled with the pine-scented air from the countless wooded islets that dotted this maritime labyrinth. For the Swedish lookouts scanning the horizon from their elevated positions, the early hours revealed nothing more threatening than the usual complement of fishing boats and merchant vessels navigating the complex channels between the islands. The Swedish squadron under command of Vice Admiral K. Sjöblad, 52-gun ship of the line, 4 frigates and 9 small crafts with 156 guns and over 1,000 marines, made an attempt to attack the Russians en route. Sjöblad had positioned his force with the calculated precision of a veteran commander, his powerful flagship leading the formation like an apex predator, stalking through familiar hunting grounds. The morning sun glinted off the polished bronze of his cannons, each gun crew standing ready at their stations, slow matches smoldering in the humid Baltic air. From the Swedish perspective, the tactical situation appeared overwhelmingly favorable. Their heavy guns could pulverize any galley fleet foolish enough to engage them in open water, and their superior seamanship would allow them to dictate the terms of engagement. The Swedish Marines, battle-hardened veterans of countless amphibious operations, stood ready to board and capture any Russian vessels that survived the initial broadside exchanges. But Golitsyn had not survived years of warfare against Swedish forces by accepting disadvantageous engagements. Russian squadron headed for Warsfare Grengam to prepare their own position for the impending battle. His galleys had slipped through the pre-dawn darkness like phantoms, their muffled oars cutting silently through the calm water as they took up carefully reconnoitered positions among the granite outcroppings and hidden channels that only local pilots knew existed. In the conditions of storm wind and high waves, sea battle had to be postponed. The weather itself seemed to conspire against conventional naval warfare as the Baltic's notorious unpredictability began to assert itself. What had begun as a gentle morning breeze was building into something more substantial, creating the kind of confused seas that could turn a well-planned naval engagement into chaos. As the morning progressed, the two fleets found themselves locked in a deadly dance of positioning and counter-positioning. Sjöblad's heavy ships maneuvered to bring their devastating broadsides to bear, while Golitsyn's galleys darted between the islands like schools of predatory fish, always just beyond effective cannon range, but never quite out of sight. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not just firepower and seamanship, but the very nature of naval warfare in the Baltic's unique environment. On July 27, 1720, the Swedish squadron, taking advantage of a fair wind, began to move towards the strait, where the ships of the Russian fleet were concentrated. The moment Sjöblad had been waiting for had finally arrived. His flagship's sails billowed with the strengthening breeze as the Swedish formation advanced with the measured confidence of a naval power that had dominated these waters for generations. The thunder of approaching broadsides seemed inevitable as the distance between the fleets rapidly diminished. But Golitsyn had prepared a masterpiece of tactical deception. Golitsyn gave the order to slowly retreat, enticing Swedes in a cooked trap. Yielding to the enemy's superior artillery power, Golitsyn's fleet retreated to the Skerries. To the Swedish observers, the Russian withdrawal appeared to confirm everything they believed about their enemy's cowardice and incompetence. Here were the upstart Russians, faced with real Swedish naval power, fleeing like rabbits into the maze of islands and rocks. Golitsyn managed to take position of advantage in the narrow Strait of Flesesund and ordered his ships in semicircle line. The Russian admiral had transformed the apparent retreat into a calculated lure, drawing the Swedish heavy ships into waters where their advantages would become liabilities. The Flesesund Strait, a narrow channel between islands where local currents created treacherous crosswinds, was precisely the kind of terrain where galley tactics could neutralize conventional naval superiority. The Swedes started in pursuit of the Russian vessels, but Golitsyn, a shrewd and experienced officer, enticed the enemy into a disadvantageous position and seized his opportunity. What had seemed like a rout was rapidly revealing itself as something far more sinister. Swedish officers aboard the flagship began to notice disturbing details. The Russian galleys weren't fleeing in panic, but withdrawing in disciplined formation, always maintaining just enough distance to avoid effective cannon fire while steadily drawing the Swedish ships deeper into the island maze. When 4 frigates of the Swedish fleet, led by the flagship, entered the Flesesund Strait, the Russian squadron took up its previous positions, blocking the Swedes from escaping the trap. The moment of realization struck Sjöblad's command like a physical blow. They had been outmaneuvered. The pursuing Swedish vessels suddenly found themselves in a narrow channel, with Russian galleys positioned at both ends, their escape routes blocked by the very islands they had thought provided cover for fleeing enemies. The granite coastal boulders, in effect, came to Golitsyn's aid. 2 Swedish frigates were run against them, seized and boarded. The trap had sprung with devastating efficiency. In the confined waters of the strait, the Swedish ships' superior firepower meant nothing if they couldn't maneuver to bring their guns to bear, while the granite outcroppings that dotted the channel turned navigation into a nightmare for vessels designed for open water combat. The hunters had become the hunted, and the Baltic was about to witness a masterclass in how terrain and tactics could triumph over raw naval power. The first Russian galley to reach the stranded Swedish frigates came under a withering hail of musket fire from the trapped vessel's marines. Swedish officers, their dress uniforms now stained with powder smoke and blood, rallied their men with desperate courage as the sleek Russian galleys converged like wolves on wounded prey. The narrow confines of the Flesesund Strait echoed with the clash of cutlass against pike, the thunderous crack of swivel guns, and the agonized cries of men fighting for their lives on blood-slick decks. In the fierce fight that followed, all the Swedish frigates were boarded. The Russians had transformed their apparent weakness into devastating strength. While Swedish Marines were superbly trained for conventional naval combat, they found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer number of boarders that each galley could deliver. Unlike traditional warships, with their limited crew space, the Russian galleys carried hundreds of soldiers specifically trained for close-quarters combat among the islands. The Swedish frigate captains fought with the fury of cornered lions, knowing that surrender would mean not just personal disgrace, but the effective end of Swedish naval resistance in these vital waters. Aboard one frigate, the captain continued directing his guns even as Russian soldiers swarmed over the bulwarks, his voice carrying clear commands until a Cossack saber finally silenced him forever. On another vessel, Swedish Marines formed a defensive square around their ship's wheel, fighting back-to-back as galleys attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. The Swedes realized their mistake and began to retreat, but it was already too late. The Russian galleys chased the Swedish vessels, and in a savage fight succeeded in defeating 2 more frigates. What had begun as a pursuit had transformed into a running battle through the island maze, with Swedish ships desperately trying to reach open water where their superior firepower might save them. But Golitsyn's galleys, with their intimate knowledge of every channel and reef, harried the retreating Swedes like hunting hounds, driving deer toward waiting nets. An attempt was made to overtake the flagship of the Swedish force, and Admiral Sjöblad himself was fortunate to escape on the damaged 52-gun Pommern. The Swedish flagship, her magnificent hull scarred by close-range cannon fire and her rigging shredded by Russian grape shot, limped away from the carnage with her admiral's flag still flying, but her pride thoroughly shattered. Sjöblad's escape was as much a testament to the seamanship of his crew as it was to pure luck, and the knowledge that Golitsyn had already achieved everything he needed. The waters around Grengam Island ran red with Swedish blood, and the myth of Swedish naval invincibility in the Baltic died with the captured frigates that now flew Russian colors. As the gun smoke cleared and the last echoes of combat faded across the water, the full magnitude of the disaster became apparent to both fleets. The Swedes lost 103 killed and 407 captured. The Russians had 82 killed and 236 wounded. The Swedish casualties told a grim story. More than half their losses were prisoners, men who would soon find themselves in Russian dungeons, their knowledge of Swedish naval tactics and coastal defenses extracted through methods that made conventional warfare seem merciful by comparison. 4 Swedish frigates, the 34-gun frigate Stor Phoenix, the 30-gun Vancouver, the 22-gun Kiskin, and the 18-gun Danska Örn were captured by the Russians. These weren't just ships lost. They represented a quarter-century of Swedish shipbuilding expertise, their cannon foundry's finest work, and most critically, their trained crews who had taken decades to develop. Each captured vessel meant not only immediate tactical loss, but the transfer of invaluable maritime knowledge to Sweden's greatest enemy. For the Russians, however, the victory came at a price that extended far beyond the official casualty figures. 42 galleys were damaged, and galley Westfish was abandoned and burnt after the battle. Golitsyn's fleet had fought itself nearly to destruction in achieving this triumph. The intricate network of oars, rigging, and rowing benches that made galley warfare possible had been shattered by Swedish resistance, leaving many vessels barely seaworthy. The human cost aboard the Russian galleys painted a picture of desperate, close-quarters fighting that had pushed both sides to their absolute limits. Russian Marines bore wounds from Swedish cutlasses and boarding pikes, while galley rowers, many of them convicts and conscripts, had died chained to their benches when Swedish cannon fire smashed through the thin hulls. The stench of blood, gunpowder, and death hung over the Russian fleet like a noxious cloud. Yet Golitsyn understood the strategic calculus with crystal clarity. Russia celebrated the battle as a victory, but their fleet was unable to launch effective operations until the end of the war in 1721. The Russian admiral had sacrificed his fleet's immediate operational capability to achieve something far more valuable: proof that Swedish naval power could be broken, that the Baltic was no longer an impregnable Swedish lake. As both fleets limped away from the blood-stained waters around Grengam Island, they carried with them the knowledge that the age of Swedish naval supremacy was ending. The balance of power in the Baltic had shifted permanently, written in the smoke and carnage of a single morning's brutal combat. The wounded lay scattered across the decks of both fleets like broken dolls, their groans mixing with the creak of damaged rigging and the gentle lapping of waves against bullet-scarred hulls. Aboard the surviving Swedish vessels, ship's surgeons worked by flickering lantern light, their crude instruments gleaming with blood as they attempted to save what limbs and lives they could. The acrid smell of cauterizing irons filled the air as screaming sailors had shattered bones amputated without anesthesia, their only comfort a leather strap between their teeth and a tot of rum if supplies permitted. On the Russian galleys, the carnage presented an even more horrific tableau. Swedish Vice Admiral Carl Georg Zioblad was initially criticized after the battle, but when the scope of the Russian losses were discovered, he was praised. The galley benches, where hundreds of oarsmen had pulled in coordinated rhythm just hours before, now resembled charnel houses. Swedish grapeshot had swept through the packed rowing decks with devastating effect, leaving tangled masses of chain, splintered wood, and human remains that defied easy separation. Russian medical care, primitive even by the standards of the era, struggled to cope with the massive casualties. Many wounded rowers, still chained to their positions, had to be cut free by their surviving comrades, a grisly process that often cost the injured men their remaining limbs. The ship's carpenters, pressed into service as emergency surgeons, wielded their saws and chisels on human flesh with the same brutal efficiency they normally reserved for mending masts and hull planking. The psychological wounds ran deeper than the physical ones. Swedish Marines who had surrendered after fighting with legendary courage now faced an uncertain fate in Russian captivity. Many had witnessed their officers cut down while trying to maintain discipline during the final desperate boarding actions. The professional pride that had sustained Swedish naval power for generations lay shattered alongside the broken bodies of their comrades. For Golitsyn's surviving officers, victory tasted bitter as they surveyed their devastated fleet. The galleys that remained afloat were riddled with shot holes, their intricate rowing mechanisms smashed beyond easy repair. Entire sections of trained oarsmen, the specialized crews whose coordinated efforts made galley warfare possible, had been obliterated by Swedish cannon fire. The knowledge that they had broken Swedish naval power came with the sobering realization that they had nearly destroyed themselves in the process. As night fell over the Baltic, both fleets began the grim task of counting their dead and assessing damage that would take months to repair. The waters around Grengam Island had witnessed the end of an era, but the survivors would carry the scars of that terrible day for the rest of their lives. The news of Grengam rippled across the courts of Europe like seismic tremors, shattering long-held assumptions about Baltic naval supremacy. In Stockholm, the Swedish Regency Council received Zioblad's battle report with a mixture of disbelief and growing dread. 4 frigates lost, hundreds of trained sailors in Russian hands, and their once invincible Baltic fleet reduced to a shadow of its former strength. The psychological impact proved even more devastating than the material losses, as Swedish naval officers began to question whether their traditional tactics could survive in an age of Russian innovation. The Battle of Grengam demonstrated the skillful usage of rowing fleet in the Siskeries environment, efficient reconnaissance and selection of combat site, as well as perfect timing for the attack from different directions. The victory at Grengam allowed the Russians to consolidate in the archipelago that was very important to carry out the operations against Swedish shipping in the area. Peter the Great had achieved something his predecessors could never have imagined, transforming Russia from a landlocked power into a naval force capable of challenging Europe's most experienced maritime nation in its own territorial waters. The captured Swedish frigates became floating symbols of this transformation. Russian naval engineers swarmed over the prizes, studying Swedish cannon design, examining the sophisticated rigging systems, and interrogating captured sailors about navigation techniques that had been Swedish naval secrets for generations. Every technical innovation, every tactical manual, every chart and compass reading was methodically catalogued and absorbed into Russia's expanding maritime knowledge base. For the broader Baltic region, Grengam marked the beginning of a new strategic reality. Merchant vessels that had once sailed under Swedish protection now found themselves vulnerable to Russian raiders operating from newly established bases in the archipelago. Trade routes that had remained stable for decades suddenly became hazardous passages where Russian galleys might emerge from any island cluster to seize cargo and crews. Like the previous Battle of Ganget, the Battle of Grengam was fought on St. Pantaleon Day. In order to commemorate the perceived victory, a timber church to this saint was built in St. Petersburg in 1722. It was rebuilt in stone in 1735 and 1739. Peter's commemoration of the victory revealed his understanding of its deeper significance. This wasn't merely another tactical success, but a spiritual and cultural triumph that deserved permanent architectural recognition in his new capital. The Swedish Empire's grip on the Baltic had been broken not by superior numbers or firepower, but by tactical innovation and intimate knowledge of local waters. The age of Swedish dominance was ending, and a new chapter in Baltic history was beginning, one written in Russian ink across Swedish waters. The tactical innovations displayed at Grengam sent shockwaves through naval academies across Europe, forcing a fundamental reassessment of maritime warfare doctrine that had remained unchanged for centuries. Traditional naval theorists, accustomed to thinking in terms of line-of-battle engagements where heavy ships traded devastating broadsides in open water, suddenly found their cherished principles rendered obsolete by Golitsyn's unconventional approach. The Russian admiral had proven that mobility, terrain knowledge, and tactical deception could triumph over raw firepower, a lesson that would reshape naval thinking for generations to come. The Swedish defeat exposed the dangerous rigidity of conventional naval doctrine. Their officers, trained in the proud traditions of broadside warfare and disciplined fleet maneuvers, had been utterly unprepared for an enemy who refused to fight according to established rules. Golitsyn's galleys operated more like maritime cavalry than traditional warships, using hit-and-run tactics that neutralized Swedish advantages while exploiting weaknesses that Swedish naval theory had never acknowledged. European naval observers studying the battle's aftermath identified revolutionary principles that challenged fundamental assumptions about sea power. The engagement demonstrated that local geographical knowledge could be more valuable than superior weaponry, that feigned retreats could be more effective than direct assault, and that unconventional vessels operating in suitable terrain could defeat supposedly superior forces. These insights would influence naval strategy from the Mediterranean to the North Sea as commanders began to appreciate the tactical possibilities of shallow-water warfare. The broader implications extended beyond mere tactical innovation. Grengam proved that naval supremacy could not be maintained through tradition and past glory alone. It required constant adaptation to new threats and innovative thinking about how geography, technology, and tactics intersected. The Swedish Empire's centuries-old naval doctrine had ossified into ritual, while Peter's Russians approached each engagement as a problem to be solved, rather than a ceremony to be performed. Most significantly, the battle revealed how quickly maritime dominance could shift when challenged by determined innovation. Sweden's Baltic supremacy, built over generations of successful warfare, had crumbled in a single morning because they failed to recognize that their enemies were no longer the same amateur sailors they had once easily defeated. The waters around Grengam Island had witnessed not just a tactical victory, but a paradigm shift that would echo through naval warfare for centuries to come. The formal conclusion of the Great Northern War came with the Swedish Hanoverian and Swedish-Prussian treaties of Stockholm, 1719, the Dano-Swedish Treaty of Frederiksborg, 1720, and the Russo-Swedish Treaty of Neustadt, 1721. When the diplomatic quills finally fell silent, the map of Northern Europe bore little resemblance to the world that had existed when young Charles XIII first donned his crown. By these treaties, Sweden ceded its exemption from the Sound dues and lost the Baltic provinces and the southern part of Swedish Pomerania. The Swedish Empire, once master of the Baltic, had been reduced to a regional power clinging to its Scandinavian heartland. The war ended with the defeat of Sweden, leaving Russia as the new dominant power in the Baltic region and as a new major force in European politics. Peter the Great's vision of transforming Russia from a landlocked giant into a maritime empire had been realized in the blood-stained waters of battles like Grengam. The ramshackle fleet of converted river barges and hastily trained peasant sailors had evolved into a naval force capable of challenging the most experienced maritime powers in Europe. The human stories that emerged from Grengam's aftermath became the stuff of naval legend. Admiral Sjöblad, initially condemned for his defeat, lived to see his reputation rehabilitated as the true scope of Russian losses became apparent. He had fought a brilliant tactical withdrawal that preserved the core of Swedish naval power for future campaigns. Golitsyn, meanwhile, became the architect of a new form of naval warfare, his name whispered with respect in maritime circles, from London to Constantinople. The captured Swedish sailors who survived Russian captivity returned home with tales that fundamentally altered Swedish naval culture. They spoke of Russian innovation, of tactical flexibility that had turned apparent weakness into devastating strength, and of a new generation of naval officers who approached warfare as problem-solving rather than ritual. These accounts sparked a revolution in Swedish naval thinking that would influence their maritime doctrine for decades to come. The peace with Tsar Peter's Russia was made in Neustadt, Uusikaupunki, on the 30.8th 1721. As the final peace treaty was signed, the Baltic Sea itself bore witness to the transformation. Where once Swedish merchant vessels had sailed under the protection of an invincible fleet, Russian warships now patrolled waters that had been Swedish preserves for generations. The echoes of Grengam's cannons had faded, but their message resonated across the waves. The age of Swedish naval supremacy was over, and the Russian Empire had announced its arrival as a true maritime power, with the thunder of galley guns in the island maze of the Baltic archipelago.